retire at 40, and just travel the world. That's how the people who knew Stephen Clayton described the life he built for himself. A kid from Miami with 5 sisters and a tough upbringing who worked construction jobs to pay his own way through Florida State and turned that grit into a physical therapy company worth millions. By 40, he'd done what most people only dream about. He walked away from work entirely and spent the rest of his life traveling, mentoring young athletes, collecting fine art, and filling his Lake Wiley mansion with friends and family almost every weekend. His nephew Chris remembers the dogs running around the yard, the music playing, Steve cracking jokes while the kids chased each other through the house. On July 21st, 2018, Stephen Clayton was found dead at the bottom of his own staircase. Viewer discretion is advised. This case involves poisoning and details of domestic abuse allegations that are disputed throughout the story. Welcome to the homicide room, where the monsters are fished out for punishment. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch how this one unfolds. And in the comments, let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far this community stretches. Now, let's rewind to the beginning, long before the mansion modeled after Mount Vernon. Long before the millions, the wine cellar, the fine art collection lining the walls of a waterfront estate. Stephen Clayton was just a kid growing up in Hialeah in Miami Springs, Florida, one of 6 children, the only boy among 5 sisters named Rosie, Valerie, Patricia, Carmen, and Rosemary. Picture South Florida in the 1950s and 60s, humid, sprawling, still finding its shape. Neighborhoods full of young families, kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on, the kind of place where everyone on the block knew everyone else's business. That was the world Stephen Clayton was born into on May 1st, 1954. Not much has ever been documented about his earliest years. No scandal, no dramatic origin story, nothing that made the local papers. But the people who knew him best, later in life, always described the same thing when asked about where he came from. Whatever hardship he faced growing up, he turned it into fuel. 6 kids in one household meant there wasn't much room for anyone to be handed anything. If Stephen wanted something, the lesson seemed to be he was going to have to go get it himself. Being the only boy among 5 sisters shaped him in ways his family would later point to when trying to explain the man he became. He grew up surrounded by women, in a household where he learned early on how to listen, how to be useful, how to hold his own in a family dynamic that could have easily left him on the outside looking in. Instead, by every account, he became close with each of his sisters in his own way, relationships that lasted his entire life, and that would later play a devastating role in how his family processed his death. He attended Miami Military Academy and later Miami Springs Senior High School, where he found an outlet for that same drive in athletics. He ran track. He played football. He wrestled competitively in the Greco-Roman style, a discipline that demands patience as much as power. You don't win those matches through brute force alone. You win them by outlasting the person across from you. Friends who knew him at that age described someone disciplined and competitive in a way that went beyond just wanting to win. He was the kind of kid who showed up early to practice and stayed late, long after the coaches had gone home. After graduating high school, Stephen enrolled at Florida State University. There was no trust fund waiting for him there, no family business to walk into, no easy path laid out in advance. He worked his way through college as a construction laborer and a plasterer, physically demanding work, done in the kind of Florida heat that makes ordinary chores feel like punishment, just so he could pay for an education nobody else was going to hand him. Every semester he completed was a semester he'd paid for himself. Through labor most college students his age never had to consider. In 1976, all of that work paid off. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree, and he didn't stop there. He went on to become a certified public accountant, trading in physical labor for the discipline of numbers, and took a job working in finance at Holy Cross Hospital in Fort Lauderdale. A stable, respectable position that most people in his shoes would have happily settled into for the rest of their careers. But Stephen Clayton wasn't the type to stay comfortable for long. He eventually left that job to start something entirely his own, a company called Physical Therapy Resources, built around treating sports injuries. It was the kind of leap that could have gone nowhere. Plenty of small businesses fail in their first few years. Instead, it exploded into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. By age 40, Stephen Clayton had done something almost nobody manages to do. He retired. Not because he'd run out of ambition, and not because he was burned out, but because he'd already proven everything he'd set out to prove, and he wanted the rest of his life to be about something else entirely. Freedom, adventure, and more than anything, other people. Think about that for a second. Most people who build a company from the ground up don't walk away from it at 40. They stay, because the identity of founder becomes tangled up with who they are as a person. Stephen wasn't interested in that trap. This wasn't a man chasing status. This was a man chasing a life. Retirement, for most people, means slowing down. A quieter pace, fewer obligations, more time spent alone with a book or a garden. For Stephen Clayton, it meant the exact opposite. It meant expanding outward into the lives of everyone around him with even more energy than before. His phone rarely stopped ringing, not because he was chasing more business deals or checking in on investments, but because he had made himself endlessly available to other people. Friends called for advice at all hours of the day and night, and he picked up, every time. It didn't matter if it was a minor problem or a real crisis. If someone he cared about needed him, Stephen answered. He never had children of his own, but that never stopped him from becoming something like a father figure to dozens of young people over the years. Kids he coached, kids he mentored, kids he simply took an interest in because he saw something worth investing in. Many of them went on to build genuinely successful careers and lives, and more than a few of them would later say it happened, at least in part, because of the guidance and the opportunities Stephen pushed their way, sometimes without even being asked. He coached wrestling, the same discipline he'd competed in himself as a teenager, at the University of South Florida, at American Heritage Academy, and at Cardinal Gibbons. And unlike a lot of coaches who move on once a season ends, Stephen stayed close with the people he mentored for years afterward, checking in on birthdays, remembering the small details of their lives, showing up when it mattered. Friends described him using the same word again and again, magnanimous, larger than life. A man with an enormous, wildly diverse circle of friends who somehow made every single one of them feel like family the moment they met him. He loved music. He loved a good glass of wine, a fine cigar, the ritual of sitting down and actually savoring something instead of rushing through it. He golfed. He wrote. He collected fine art, filling his home with pieces he'd carefully chosen over the years. And he never lost his devotion to Florida State football, cheering for his alma mater with the same enthusiasm he'd had as a student decades earlier. By every account, from every direction, co-workers, mentees, neighbors, old friends, Stephen Clayton was one of the good ones. Someone who never stopped being a kid at heart, energetic and quick with a joke, always keen for the next adventure life had to offer. Some of the young athletes he coached went on to compete at the collegiate level themselves. Others simply carried the discipline he'd instilled in them into completely unrelated careers: business, medicine, law, crediting a wrestling coach who happened to also be a self-made millionaire with teaching them that hard work, not talent alone, was what actually separated the people who succeeded from the people who didn't. He never made a show of the help he gave. Former mentees would later describe scholarship money that appeared without explanation, phone calls that came at exactly the right moment, doors that opened because Stephen had quietly made a call on their behalf. It's worth pausing here, because this is the version of Stephen Clayton that almost everyone in his orbit would have described if you'd stopped them on the street in the summer of 2018 and asked who he was. Not a victim, not a headline. A man who spent the back half of his life trying to make other people's lives a little better, a little easier, a little more full of possibility than they might otherwise have been. But his personal life told a very different story than his professional one. By 2010, Stephen had been married and divorced 6 separate times. Whatever quality made him so effective at building a business from nothing, at mentoring young people, at lifting up everyone around him, it didn't seem to translate the same way into lasting romantic partnerships. And yet, almost without exception, the women he'd been married to spoke well of him after the fact. Nobody described those marriages as bitter or explosive. Nobody described him as cruel, controlling, or difficult to live with. He simply hadn't found something that stuck. Not yet. Anyway. He wasn't someone who treated marriage casually, jumping in and out of relationships without care. By every account, he approached each one earnestly, genuinely believing, each time, that he'd found something lasting. He was, in the words of people who knew him well, a hopeless romantic. Each divorce, by the accounts available, ended amicably enough that his exes continued to speak well of him for years afterward. There was no pattern of him growing bitter, controlling, or resentful as the marriages piled up. If anything, the opposite seemed true. He kept opening himself back up to the same vulnerability, over and over, hoping the next one would be different. In 2010, when he met Lena online, he was, by his family's account, genuinely hopeful in a way that friends hadn't seen from him in years. Stephen met Lena Clayton online in 2010 at a point in his life when he'd already built and lost enough relationships to know exactly what he was and wasn't looking for. Lena was a nurse. And by every account from people close to him, Stephen was drawn to her almost immediately, specifically to that caring, nurturing quality that seemed to define her. His sister Rosie remembered sensing something real between them, right from the start. Not performative, not convenient. Something that, at least from the outside, felt genuine on both sides. Steve loved Lena, Rosie said, and Lena, it seemed, loved him too. 3 years later, in 2013, they married in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was Lena's second marriage. She brought children from her first marriage into the relationship, blending two families the way so many couples do later in life. 2 years after the wedding, in 2015, they made a major decision together, relocating from North Carolina to South Carolina, buying a sprawling waterfront estate right on Lake Wylie near the North Carolina border. The house itself was almost absurdly grand, modeled directly after George Washington's Mount Vernon estate, sitting right on the water, the kind of property that stops people in their tracks the first time they see it. Columns rising along the front facade, a sweeping lawn running down toward the lake, enough square footage to comfortably host the constant stream of visitors the Claytons became known for. For a man who'd started his adult life plastering walls to pay for community college textbooks, there was something almost poetic about the idea of him now restoring that mansion by hand, room by room, with the same hard-earned patience. Friends said he took real pride in the work itself, not just the finished result. That he'd walk visitors through the property, pointing out details he'd personally overseen, the way a craftsman shows off a piece he built rather than simply bought. They filled that house with life, constantly. 2 Italian greyhounds, named Guinness and Sadie, ran through the halls and across the lawn. Stephen, ever the social one, kept the home full of visitors. Friends, extended family, his nephews and nieces, all of it. His nephew Chris later remembered weekend gatherings where the dogs would be chasing the kids around the yard, music would be playing somewhere in the house, and Steve would be in the middle of it all, telling jokes, making sure everyone was having a good time. On the 4th of July in 2018, just weeks before everything changed, they threw a party complete with fireworks and a dance floor set up outside. To the people around them, Steve and Lena looked, by every outward measure, like a couple who genuinely had it all. Their close friend and neighbor, Terry Floyd, remembered the small, ordinary gestures of affection between them. Lena walking over to Steve, kissing him on the forehead, telling him she loved him, in front of other people, without any hesitation. Lena was active in a local Bible study group. People who knew her described her, consistently, as sweet, grounded, and kind. Lena was working during this period too, still employed as a nurse at several different veterans hospitals in the region, splitting her time between caring for patients professionally and, according to everyone around her, caring for her husband at home. She wasn't a woman of leisure living off her husband's fortune. She had her own career, her own patients, her own daily routine that had nothing to do with Steve's money. That detail matters because it's part of what made her so believable to everyone in her orbit. If anything, it made her seem like exactly the kind of partner Steve needed as he got older. Someone with the medical knowledge to look after him properly if his health ever started to slip. Dr. Nancy, a veterinarian who cared for the couple's 2 Italian greyhounds and spent time around the Clayton household, would later describe something that stood in sharp contrast to everyone else's account. Watching the two of them together, she said, never felt like watching a loving couple. She remembers wondering, privately, why they'd ever gotten married in the first place. There was something strange about the dynamic between them. Something as simple as the fact that Lena rarely spoke when Steve was in the room. It's a small detail, easy to overlook, the kind of thing a person might not even mention unless someone specifically asked. But it sat there, quietly, at odds with the version of the marriage everyone else described. Two very different pictures of the same relationship, both held by people who spent real time inside that house. Then came July 21st, just like an ordinary South Carolina afternoon, hot and still, the kind of day that blends into every other day of a southern summer. Just after 1 p.m., a motorcyclist named James Blacktedge was riding down the street near the Clayton estate when a woman came running out of the house toward the road, waving frantically for him to stop. It was Lena. "You need to call 911, she told him, breathless. "My husband's falling down the stairs, and I think that he's dead." James pulled over immediately and got a dispatcher on the line. As he relayed what little he knew, Lena took off again, this time toward a neighbor's house. Terry Floyd, the same friend who had always seen Steve and Lena as a genuinely loving couple. Terry rushed out the second he heard the banging on his door, asking what was wrong. Lena told him she thought it was Steve. They didn't wait for an ambulance. They climbed into Terry's golf cart and drove straight back to the Clayton house. Lena stayed outside, visibly in hysterics, while Terry went in alone. Inside, in the foyer, at the base of the grand staircase, he found Steve. He rushed over, checking for a pulse, trying to find any sign of life. There was none. Terry knew, almost instantly, that his friend was gone. When emergency responders arrived at the property shortly after, they confirmed what Terry already suspected. 64-year-old Stephen Clayton was pronounced dead at the scene, in the entryway of the home he'd spent years building into something beautiful. Take a moment to picture that foyer, a grand staircase sweeping down into an entryway, meant to impress guests the second they walked through the door. This exact space, this exact entrance, had been the heart of the home Steve shared with his wife. And now it was the place where his life ended. James Blacktedge, the motorcyclist who happened to be riding past at exactly the wrong, or right, moment, later gave his account to dispatch, his voice audibly shaken on the recorded call. A stranger to the family, pulled into the most chaotic afternoon of their lives simply because he happened to be on that stretch of road at 1 p.m. on a Saturday. He had no idea, in that moment, that he was about to become one of the first outside witnesses to a story that would unfold over the following weeks into something far darker than a tragic fall. Outside the house, surrounded by first responders and the beginning of a small, stunned crowd of neighbors and friends, Lena began to explain what she believed had happened. Steve, she said, had been sick for days, a severe case of vertigo that left him dizzy, nauseous, and essentially bedridden in their upstairs bedroom. He hadn't wanted to see a doctor about it. Lena, being a trained nurse, had taken it upon herself to look after him during that stretch, she said, bringing him water, making sure he had his medication, checking in on him throughout each day. That morning, she told investigators, she'd gone upstairs to check on him around 11 a.m. He was asleep. Since the property was large and the lawn needed attention, she decided to go outside and mow, a task that ended up taking a couple of hours in the heat. When she finally came back inside, she said she found him at the bottom of the stairs, unconscious. She tried to roll him over to begin CPR, but he was too heavy for her to move on her own. That's when she ran outside, first flagging down a stranger on a motorcycle, then racing to get her neighbor. To the first responders standing in that foyer, the story made a certain amount of sense on its face. Steve was in his 60s. He had some underlying health concerns that weren't unusual for a man his age. He'd reportedly been unwell for days already. It looked, on the surface, like a man who had tried to get up, gotten disoriented on the stairs because of his vertigo, and fallen to his death. A tragic accident, nothing more. Lena appeared devastated throughout, blaming herself repeatedly for not checking on him sooner, for being outside mowing the lawn when it happened. Officers on scene comforted her. Terry stayed close, comforting her as well. As word of Steve's death began to spread through the neighborhood and out to friends and extended family, more and more people arrived at the house to be with Lena in what everyone assumed was simply a shared moment of grief. The coroner arrived at the property shortly after 1 p.m. She examined the scene and found no bruises, no abrasions, nothing consistent with a violent fall down a flight of stairs. What she did find was some discoloration that, in her assessment, suggested a possible heart attack, as though Steve had made it to the bottom of the stairs and simply collapsed there. Her conclusion, delivered that same day, this appeared, at least on the surface, to be a natural death. Think about how many separate professionals, in those first few hours, independently arrived at some version of the same conclusion. James Blacktedge saw a distraught wife and made an emergency call. Terry Floyd saw a friend in crisis and rushed to help without a second thought. The first responding officers saw an elderly adjacent man with known health issues at the bottom of a staircase. And the coroner, examining the body directly, saw nothing that visibly contradicted the story she'd been told. Every single one of them was working with the information available to them in that moment, and every single one of them was, understandably, inclined to believe a grieving spouse rather than suspect her. That's not a failure of any one person. It's simply how these situations tend to unfold in the earliest hours before anyone has a reason to look deeper. Poisoning, unlike a gunshot or a stabbing, doesn't announce itself. There's no wound to examine, no obvious trauma pointing toward violence. It hides in plain sight, indistinguishable on the surface from the natural decline of an aging body. It could have ended right there. For most families in that exact situation, it very likely would have. A grieving widow, a natural-sounding cause of death, a coroner willing to sign off without a second look. Case closed, funeral scheduled, life quietly moving on for everyone except the man in the foyer. If you're watching this and wondering how many other deaths get filed away this same way, a plausible story, a distracted first responder, a family too devastated to ask hard questions in the first hours of their grief, let us know in the comments. It's one of the more unsettling questions this case raises, and it's exactly why what happened next mattered so much. Word of Steve's death reached his nephew, Nick French, an experienced police officer working in a nearby town. He didn't hear it secondhand for long before he was in his car, driving straight to the house. When he arrived, the scene was still raw. Lena was distraught, and the deputy coroner had already begun gently raising the subject of funeral arrangements with her. Lena sat with her head in her hands, telling the coroner she didn't know what to do, that it was all simply too much to think about right now. Then the coroner mentioned, almost in passing, the possibility of taking Steve's body in for a full autopsy. Nick, standing nearby, told Lena he thought that sounded like a good idea. It was a natural thing to say, a standard step, especially for a sudden death, and something most families would agree to without much thought. But in that exact moment, something in Lena shifted. She lifted her head out of her hands and said, with sudden clarity, that there was a funeral home nearby. They should just take him there, have him cremated. On its own, that request wasn't necessarily damning. Plenty of grieving spouses, understandably, don't want an autopsy performed on someone they loved, especially when there's no obvious reason to suspect foul play. But Nick was trained to notice exactly this kind of inconsistency, and he couldn't shake how quickly Lena had gone from paralyzed indecision. I don't know what to do. It's all too much. To a firm, specific, immediate request the second an autopsy was mentioned. Then Nick suggested they call Chris, Steve's other nephew, someone who had always been especially close with his uncle. Lena said no. Nick pushed gently, saying Chris deserved to know, that he was an adult who could handle the news. She said no again. When Nick raised it a third time, Lena snapped at him, her voice sharp in a way that surprised him. That was enough. Nick went upstairs, away from the immediate chaos of the living room, and called Chris himself to break the news. Consider, for a moment, what it must have felt like to be Nick French in that house on that particular afternoon. He wasn't just a grieving nephew. He was a trained officer, someone whose entire professional instinct was built around noticing exactly the kind of inconsistencies that were now piling up in front of him. That created an almost impossible internal conflict. Part of him was mourning an uncle he clearly loved. Another part of him, the trained investigator, couldn't stop cataloging every small detail that didn't quite fit. Most people in his position, overwhelmed by grief, wouldn't have had the presence of mind to notice any of it. Nick did. And that single trait, the refusal to simply accept the easiest explanation, even while grieving, turned out to be the first domino in an investigation that would eventually expose exactly what had happened inside that house. Steve's body was taken to the local funeral home under Lena's request, with his cremation scheduled for just 2 days later. A remarkably fast timeline for a man whose death had, only hours earlier, been treated as a possible tragic accident. When Chris arrived at the house, he went straight to Lena to comfort her. She told him she'd need some help organizing Steve's affairs in the days ahead. Chris, thinking practically, suggested they start by locating his will so they'd know exactly what he wanted done: burial, cremation, and everything else that would need to be handled. Lena told him there wasn't one. Chris knew immediately that wasn't true. He had seen the will himself at some point in the past. Steve had even asked him, directly, to serve as its executor. This wasn't a vague memory or a guess on Chris's part. He knew, with certainty, that the document existed. When he pushed back gently, explaining that he'd seen it and offering to help track it down, Lena stood up abruptly. "I said there is no will," she told him, and walked away into the house. For Chris, that was the moment alarm bells started ringing loudly. It got stranger from there. In the kitchen, Lena began telling stories that painted Steve as a hardcore drug user, stories that didn't match anything either Nick or Chris had ever heard about him, stories nobody in the family recognized at all. Nick, overhearing from another room, heard her explain that she didn't want an autopsy performed because she was worried about what the toxicology report might reveal regarding Steve's supposed illicit drug use. Nobody who actually knew Steve believed a word of it. He drank socially, the way plenty of retired 60-somethings do. He might have smoked marijuana occasionally, which, even if true, was hardly a scandal for a man enjoying his retirement. None of it matched the picture Lena was now, suddenly and specifically, painting to anyone who would listen. While all of this unfolded, Nick quietly did a walkthrough of the house, looking for anything that might explain his growing unease. What he found only deepened it. There were 2 working phones inside the home, and yet Lena hadn't used either of them to call 911 herself. She'd instead run outside and flagged down a complete stranger riding by on a motorcycle. Steve's own phone, the device his family had always described as his lifeline, was nowhere to be found anywhere in the house. Despite being a trained nurse, someone with the exact skills needed in an emergency, Lena hadn't attempted CPR when she supposedly found him at the bottom of the stairs. And upstairs, in the bedroom where Steve had reportedly spent the last several days recovering, the bed was soaked completely through with urine, clear evidence that he'd been far too incapacitated for far too long to even get himself up into a bathroom. When Nick asked Lena directly about the state of the bed, she brushed it off without much concern. "That's just what happens with vertigo sometimes," she told him. But Nick knew that didn't sit right either. Steve's sister Rosie had told the family, years earlier, that one of the things Steve had loved most about Lena, right from the beginning, was precisely that she was a nurse. Someone who would know how to take care of him if he ever got sick, someone he could rely on. If Lena had truly been caring for her husband over those 3 days, sleeping beside him, checking on him regularly the way she claimed, it simply didn't add up that the sheets would have been left in that condition, untouched, for that long. The following day, when Chris and his wife planned to come back to the house to help Lena search for the will, she told him firmly not to come. She said she would handle everything herself, and she ended the call abruptly. Chris called Nick the moment he hung up. Both men, independently arriving at the same conclusion, agreed that something was very wrong. Sit with the full list for a second, because on their own, any single one of these details could be explained away. Grief makes people behave strangely, but red flags rarely arrive one at a time in a case like this. They arrive in clusters, each one a little harder to explain than the last, until the explanations stop making sense together as a whole. A missing will that definitely exists. A rushed cremation request the moment an autopsy is mentioned. Fabricated stories about drug use that nobody recognizes. A missing phone that was supposedly his lifeline. No CPR attempted by a trained nurse. A urine-soaked bed that contradicts the entire caretaking narrative. And now, a widow who was actively keeping her husband's own family out of the house in the days immediately following his death. Individually, none of it proves anything. Together, it reads like a woman working very hard to control a story before anyone else could start asking questions about it. With Steve's cremation now just a day away, Nick and Chris moved quickly, reaching out directly to the coroner and requesting that a full autopsy and toxicology screening be performed before it was too late to find out the truth. The coroner agreed. The autopsy results came back first, and on their own, they weren't especially damning. Steve hadn't died of a heart attack after all, and there was nothing structurally wrong with his heart, lungs, or chest that would explain a sudden collapse. He did have some underlying health issues that, taken in isolation, could plausibly have contributed to a natural death down the line. Gallbladder disease, an enlarged heart, some congestion in his lungs. None of it, by itself, screamed homicide. The toxicology report was a different story entirely. It came back in mid-August, and it revealed something almost nobody involved in the case had anticipated, a massive concentration of a chemical called tetrahydrozoline, the same active ingredient found in ordinary, over-the-counter eye drops, the kind sitting in a medicine cabinet in millions of American homes. The amount discovered in Steve's system was roughly 30 times what you'd expect from someone simply using the drops as intended in their eyes. The toxicologist's conclusion was unambiguous. This was, without question, the cause of death. Investigators were now staring at two very different possibilities. Either this was a tragic, freak, accidental overdose, almost impossible to explain given the amount involved, or it was something far more deliberate and far more disturbing. As detectives began digging deeper into the couple's history together, they came across an incident from 2016 that suddenly took on new weight. One night, Lena had reportedly shot Steve in the head with a crossbow while he slept. At the time, both of them described it as a pure accident. His injuries had been minor, almost miraculously so, and no charges were ever filed. In light of what the toxicology report had just revealed, that accident from 2 years earlier looked very different indeed. Before we go further, it's worth understanding exactly what tetrahydrozoline is and why something this ordinary could end up being the thing that killed a healthy, active 64-year-old man. Tetrahydrozoline is a vasoconstrictor, a chemical that narrows blood vessels. In an eye, applied in the tiny amounts a bottle of Visine or a similar product is designed to deliver. That's exactly what makes the redness disappear. But swallowed in large quantities, that same vessel-narrowing effect turns from cosmetic to catastrophic. It doesn't just affect the eyes, it affects blood pressure, heart rate, and the central nervous system throughout the entire body. In high enough doses, it can cause severe drops in heart rate, dangerously low blood pressure, seizures, coma, and death. Poison control centers have documented cases for decades, most of them involving small children who accidentally ingested eye drops left within reach. Fatal, deliberate adult poisonings using the exact same chemical are far rarer. Rare enough that, at the time, investigators had to do real research just to understand what they were looking at. That rarity is part of what made it. On paper, an almost perfect weapon. It's sold without a prescription in every pharmacy, grocery store, and gas station in the country. It's colorless, odorless, and virtually tasteless in the small quantities needed to make someone extremely sick. And it doesn't show up in a standard toxicology panel unless a lab specifically knows to test for it. If Nick French hadn't pushed for that testing before the cremation, if Chris hadn't insisted on tracking down that missing will, this case ends as a footnote. A sad but unremarkable natural death, the true cause never known, the killer never identified. Medical toxicologists who reviewed the case afterward pointed out something else worth knowing. Because tetrahydrozoline poisoning presents with symptoms that overlap heavily with a range of far more common conditions: low blood pressure, an irregular or slowed heart rate, disorientation, extreme fatigue. It's the kind of thing that can be, and often has been, misattributed to a pre-existing condition, especially in a patient who already has documented heart or health issues, the way Steve did. A less thorough coroner, a family less inclined to push back, or simply a slightly different set of circumstances in those first 48 hours, and this case almost certainly ends with a death certificate reading natural causes, full stop. On August 29, 2018, the coroner, Dr. Sabrina Gast, asked Lena to come in so they could review the results of the autopsy and toxicology report together. Lena had no idea, walking through that door, that investigators had gone around her explicit wishes to obtain those results in the first place. And she certainly had no idea that the room had been wired for sound, with sheriff's investigators and FBI agents listening in from directly next door. When Dr. Gast brought up the tetrahydrozoline discovered in Steve's system, Lena didn't hesitate for even a moment. "That's his eye drops," she said, almost casually. She went on to explain that Steve had apparently put a couple of drops into his coffee every single morning for years to help move his bowels, an explanation that made almost no medical sense on its face, and one that came far too quickly from someone who clearly already knew, with total certainty, exactly what that chemical was and why it might be there. Imagine the tension in that room next door. Investigators sitting silently, headphones on, listening to a woman calmly explain away a lethal dose of poison as a decade-long bathroom remedy, knowing full well what the science actually said. Investigators moved into the room shortly after and began questioning her directly, walking her back through her account of that day, piece by piece. No CPR attempted, despite her nursing training. No emergency call placed by her own hand, even though she'd had the means to make one from inside the house. Under sustained pressure, her story began to shift in real time. She pivoted, suggesting perhaps Steve had taken his own life, that he'd struggled with an undiagnosed mood disorder, that she never knew which version of him she'd be coming home to on any given day, that he could be cruel, verbally abusive, calling her names like stupid. Eventually, she ended the interview and left, heading home. Investigators followed her there. At her house, remarkably, she agreed to keep talking, and this time, whether from exhaustion or the sheer weight of everything closing in around her, the story broke open completely. She told them that one day, while caring for Steve in bed, something in her had simply snapped. His bedside table had everything within reach: his water, his tissues, his medication, and sitting right there among it all, his bottle of Visine. She said she grabbed it and poured the entire contents into his water while he slept. She wanted him to suffer, she admitted. She was exhausted, she said, from years of what she described as his demands and his abuse. She insisted, even in that moment of confession, that she never meant to actually kill him, only to make him sick, uncomfortable, miserable for a while. In that same conversation, almost as an aside, she also admitted that the crossbow incident from 2016 hadn't been an accident at all. She told investigators it had been self-defense. It's worth noting how she got to that point at all, because the interrogation itself is a study in how a story falls apart under sustained, careful questioning. She didn't simply walk in and confess. Investigators had to work her through the inconsistencies methodically, letting each contradiction sit in the room a little longer than felt comfortable. The missing phone, the untouched CPR, and above all, why she knew, instantly and specifically, what tetrahydrozoline was and how it might have ended up in her husband's system when most people would have no idea what that chemical even was. Each answer she gave created a new question, and by the time investigators sat down with her that second time, what came out wasn't a clean, tidy confession. It was messy, self-justifying, and full of contradictions of its own. A woman insisting she never meant to kill her husband while simultaneously describing, in specific detail, exactly how she'd poisoned him. With a confession in hand, investigators now had to determine exactly what they were dealing with. Was this a case of a genuinely desperate, abused wife who lashed out in a moment of exhaustion without any real intention of killing her husband? Or was it something far more calculated? A plan carried out patiently over days, dressed up afterward as a moment of weakness? They began interviewing everyone who had known the couple, casting a wide net across friends, family, neighbors, and former partners. Not one person. Not a single friend, not a family member, not even Steve's previous wives or girlfriends, corroborated Lena's claims of abuse. Nobody had ever seen a bruise. Nobody had ever witnessed him raise his voice at her, let alone strike her. Even the woman he'd dated for 3 years before meeting Lena, Someone with every reason to speak honestly about his flaws if they existed said he was never anything close to abusive toward her. Detectives also uncovered something else worth noting. Steve had reportedly confided in a friend, months before his death, that he felt his marriage to Lena was struggling, that something had shifted between them. And under South Carolina law, if Steve had died without a valid will in place, Lena, as his legal wife, stood to inherit his entire estate outright, an estate worth several $1,000,000. That detail gave investigators a motive that had nothing to do with self-defense and everything to do with money. They came to believe Lena had destroyed the will herself. Neighbors reported seeing her at a fire burning in the backyard fire pit the day after Steve's death, the same day she had firmly told Chris to stay away while she handled everything on her own. They also came to believe she had disposed of Steve's phone by throwing it into a nearby river days before his death, deliberately cutting him off from the outside world at the exact moment he might have needed help the most. His sister Rosie had been trying to reach him for 3 full days before he died and never once got a response because the phone that had always been his lifeline was already gone. Investigators concluded that the poisoning had not been a single impulsive act carried out in one angry moment. Instead, it had unfolded methodically over 3 days, from July 19th through the 21st, with the dosage increasing each time. A theory that explained both his prolonged, worsening incapacitation and the urine-soaked bed Nick had discovered on the day of Steve's death. As a trained nurse, Lena would have known the eye drops were undetectable to someone drinking them unknowingly. On that final morning, investigators believe she administered one last, massive dose. They theorized Steve may have felt a sudden, final surge of adrenaline, tried desperately to make his way downstairs for help, and collapsed at the base of the staircase before he ever had the chance to reach it. The day after investigators left her home following her confession, Lena wrote a note saying she couldn't live with what she'd done. She took a handful of pills and turned on the gas inside her house. A neighbor happened to check on her in time, and she was rushed to the hospital and treated. On August 31st, 2018, Lena Clayton was formally taken into custody and charged with the murder of her husband. There's something worth pausing on here. The way Lena's story kept evolving to match whatever explanation seemed most likely to hold up. First, it was a tragic accident. Then it was accidental drug use on his part that she wanted to distance herself from. Then it was an impulsive act of retaliation against a man she claimed had been abusive for years. Each version arrived exactly when the previous one stopped working, which is precisely the kind of shifting narrative investigators are trained to notice. And every single time, detectives went looking for someone who could confirm even one piece of the abuse she described, they came up empty. That absence of evidence became, in its own way, its own kind of evidence. About 3 weeks after Lena's arrest, a case emerged less than 20 miles from Lake Wylie that investigators, and later, the victim's own grieving family, would come to see as a chilling echo of what had just happened to Stephen Clayton. Joshua Hunsucker reported finding his wife, 32-year-old Stacy, dead of what appeared to be a heart attack. The two had been high school sweethearts, married for 8 years, with 2 young children together. But almost immediately, Joshua's behavior afterward raised the exact same alarms Lena's had months earlier. He quickly began dating a coworker and moved her into the home he'd shared with Stacy. He refused to allow an autopsy or toxicology testing. He had Stacy's body cremated within just 2 days of her death. And within that same narrow window, he filed a claim for $250,000 in life insurance. It was Stacy's own mother who ultimately pushed for a real investigation, refusing to accept the surface explanation. Because Stacy had once been a registered blood donor, a preserved vial of her blood already existed in storage. And when investigators finally tested it, they found the exact same chemical that had killed Stephen Clayton, tetrahydrozoline, present at 30 to 40 times a normal therapeutic dose. Stacy's family later alleged, in a subsequent wrongful death lawsuit, that Joshua may have been directly inspired by the Clayton case, which had dominated local headlines just weeks before Stacy's own death. The case only grew stranger from there. When Joshua realized investigators were beginning to close in on him, he staged what appeared to be his own kidnapping, accused his in-laws of secretly drugging him, and was connected to an explosion aboard a medical helicopter. He was also accused, separately, of poisoning the couple's 10-year-old daughter using that same substance. He was arrested in December 2019, and as of this recording, has still not gone to trial. Investigators later pieced together a timeline of Stacy's health going back years before her death, long before anyone suspected foul play. Beginning in February 2013, shortly after the birth of her first child, she began experiencing unexplained medical episodes. 5 months after that, a fire tore through their home, destroying most of the family's belongings. In November 2014, following the birth of their second child, Stacy was hospitalized again. This time with a dangerously low heart rate and blood pressure, serious enough to require several days in intensive care. Then, in January 2015, she was hospitalized once more, this time going into full cardiac arrest and requiring a ventilator to survive. At the time, doctors had no explanation for any of it. Looking back now, with the knowledge of what tetrahydrozoline does to the cardiovascular system, the pattern reads very differently than it did in the moment. What makes the Hunsucker case even harder to sit with is the timeline. Stacy's mysterious cardiac episodes stretch back to 2013, years before Lena Clayton ever poisoned her own husband. If investigators are correct that Joshua drew inspiration from the widely publicized Clayton case in choosing his method, it means Stacy had already been suffering under a slower, earlier version of the exact same threat for years without anyone, including her own doctors, ever suspecting what was actually happening to her body. The Clayton case didn't create that danger. It simply gave a name to something that, tragically, may have already been unfolding in plain sight. On January 16, 2020, Lena Clayton stood before a South Carolina judge and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and tampering with food and drugs. As part of the negotiated plea deal, the original murder charge against her was formally dropped. Her defense argued that she suffered from severe, undiagnosed PTSD. The result, they claimed, of childhood sexual abuse and, separately, a sexual assault carried out by 3 fellow service members during her time in the U.S. Air Force, neither incident ever formally reported at the time it allegedly happened. Her attorneys maintained, throughout the proceedings, that Steve had physically and emotionally abused her across the entire course of their marriage. Addressing the court directly, Lena apologized to Steve's family. She insisted, once again, that she had never intended to kill him, only to make him uncomfortable, only to make him suffer enough that he would finally leave her alone. The judge presiding over the case wasn't convinced this had ever been a split-second decision made in a moment of desperation. He pointed to the obvious contradiction sitting at the center of her defense. If this had truly been a single impulsive act, why had Steve been left to suffer, alone and incapacitated, for 3 consecutive days before he finally died? The prosecution had pushed for a far harsher outcome. Solicitor Kevin Brackett told the court plainly that Lena had killed her husband for money, pointing to the burned will, the phone thrown into the water, and the calculated, multi-day nature of the poisoning as evidence that this was never about a single moment of desperation. Stephen's goddaughter, Lourdes Alvarez, fought back tears as she addressed the judge directly, urging him not to be fooled by Lena the way, she said, so many others already had. Under the terms of her plea deal, Lena avoided the far more severe penalties that would have come with a murder conviction, the possibility of life in prison, or worse. Instead, she faced a maximum of 25 years for voluntary manslaughter, and the judge handed down that exact sentence. Steve's sister Rosie told the court that no one in the family could ever be made whole again, that her brother had been the center of her entire world. His nephew Chris said Lena had stolen an extraordinary man from everyone who had ever loved him. And Nick, the nephew, whose instincts had cracked the case open in the first place, when almost everyone else was ready to accept a tragic accident, said there would be a hole left in everyone who knew Steve for the rest of their lives. Lena Clayton is currently serving her sentence at Leth Correctional Institution in Greenwood County, South Carolina. Under South Carolina sentencing guidelines for violent offenses, she is required to serve a substantial majority of that 25-year term before any possibility of parole, a detail that offered Steve's family at least some measure of assurance that this wouldn't be a short chapter in an otherwise long life for Lena. Notably, despite everything, Lena has not been awarded any portion of Steve's estate. Whatever plan may have existed, whatever motive investigators believe drove those 3 days in July of 2018, it ultimately gained her nothing except a prison sentence and the public unraveling of every story she'd told. The man who built a fortune from nothing, who worked construction jobs to pay his own way through college, who turned a single idea into a multimillion-dollar company, who retired at 40 only to spend the rest of his life lifting other people up, was killed with something sitting in a bathroom cabinet in almost every home in America, administered, drop by drop, day after day, by the very person who was supposed to be caring for him. What stays with people when they hear this story for the first time usually isn't the eye drops themselves. It's how close it came to never being discovered at all. A coroner's initial ruling of natural causes, a cremation scheduled within 48 hours, a missing will quietly dismissed as an oversight in the chaos of grief. If Nick French hadn't trusted his own instincts, if Chris hadn't refused to accept there is no will at face value, Stephen Clayton becomes a name on a headstone with no real explanation attached to it, and Lena Clayton walks away with an estate worth millions of dollars. Instead, one nephew's suspicion turned into an autopsy, one missing will turned into a question nobody could answer, and a routine toxicology screen turned into the single piece of evidence that unraveled everything. Rosie Clayton Leslie, Steve's sister, later said something that stuck with a lot of people who followed this case since. She talked about a saying in Spanish, that the blood cries out for justice. She said she hoped, one day, to meet the mother of Stacy Hunsucker because she believed that young woman's blood had been crying out for justice too. 2 families, 2 ordinary bathroom cabinets, 2 people who never saw it coming from the person closest to them. Cases like this one tend to linger with people longer than the average true crime story, and it's worth thinking about why. There's no masked stranger here. No break-in, no struggle, no obvious villain lurking in the dark. The threat, in this case, was already inside the house, sleeping in the same bed, sharing a life that looked, from every outward angle, completely ordinary and happy. It's an uncomfortable thought, but an important one. The people closest to us are, by definition, the people with the most access, the most trust, and the most opportunity. Most of the time, that trust is exactly what it appears to be. But this case is a reminder of how thin the line can be between a devoted spouse and something else entirely, and how much it can depend on whether the people around you are willing to ask hard questions when something doesn't quite add up. Stephen Clayton spent his entire adult life building people up, mentoring kids who weren't his own, answering the phone at any hour for anyone who needed him, turning a construction job and a plastering trade into a company worth millions, then giving away his time and his resources to everyone in his orbit once he no longer needed to work another day in his life. He did all of that without asking for anything in return. In the end, it wasn't the eye drops sitting quietly in a cabinet that failed him. It was trust, the same generous, open-hearted trust that had defined the way he lived his entire life. And maybe that's the real reason this case has stayed with so many people since it first made headlines. It isn't really a story about eye drops or crossbows or a marriage gone wrong behind closed doors. It's a story about what happens when the person society tells us to trust the most. A spouse, a caregiver, someone bound to you by vows and years of shared life. Turns out to be the one thing standing between you and your own survival. It just took one person, closer than anyone else, to prove that belief wrong. If this case disturbed you as much as it disturbed us, let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Homicide Room, where the monsters are fished out for punishment. We'll see you in the next one.